A veteran broke down a door to rescue his trapped neighbors from a fire, but the city's response left him in tears. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Frank Miller squinted through the smoke invading his apartment. The smell of burning and the desperate screams of the Rodriguez family from across the wall, triggering flashbacks of Quezon that he'd spent decades trying to forget. The once quiet Thursday evening had transformed into chaos. Frank's worn fingers trembled as he set down his dog-eared book about World War II on the side table, the single lamp casting long shadows across his sparse living room. At 68, with a permanently damaged knee from a war most Americans preferred not to remember, he'd crafted a life of careful routine and deliberate solitude. But tonight, that fortress of isolation was being breached by 8-year-old Emily Rodriguez's cries, piercing the thin walls like the mortars that had once torn through his platoon. Frank reached for his cane, his breath catching as another scream, this one unmistakably the mother's, cut through the night. He pushed himself up, wincing as his knee protested, a familiar burning pain shooting up his thigh. 3 shuffling steps to the door, then he stopped, hand hovering over the doorknob. What could he do? A broken-down old man who could barely navigate the building's stairs on good days. The rational part of his brain urged him to stay put, to wait for younger, stronger help to arrive. His weathered hand dropped slightly, then clenched around the brass knob as Emily's terrified voice called for her papa. The hallway greeted him with a wall of black smoke and searing heat. Frank instinctively recoiled, his lungs seizing as memories flooded in. Burning villages, screaming children, the helicopter blades whipping smoke into tornadoes above the jungle canopy. He blinked hard, forcing himself back to the present. "I've called the fire department," Mrs. Patel shouted from her doorway across the hall, her small frame wrapped in a floral nightgown, terror evident in her wide eyes. "They're coming! They're coming!" Other doors cracked open along the corridor, neighbors peering out, but hesitating to leave the safety of their apartments. Frank could hear their murmurs, see their frightened faces illuminated by the flickering orange light spilling from beneath the Rodriguez's door. Without thinking, Frank stripped off his faded flannel shirt, leaving him in just his undershirt. He unscrewed his water bottle, carried everywhere for his medications, and soaked the flannel before wrapping it around his nose and mouth. The dampness felt cool against his face, a stark contrast to the growing inferno across the hall. Gripping his cane, Frank approached the Rodriguez's door. Heat radiated through the wood, warning him away. He pressed his palm against it, then quickly withdrew it from the scorching surface. Not waiting to reconsider, he raised his cane and struck the door hard, again and again, each impact jarring his shoulders and sending jolts of pain through his arthritic joints. The door splintered inward on the 5th blow. A blast of superheated air and thick smoke billowed out, forcing Frank to shield his face. Hunching low, he stepped into hell. Inside, chaos reigned. Furniture smoldered, curtains blazed, and flames licked up one wall toward the ceiling. Through the smoke, Frank made out Mr. Rodriguez frantically trying to move a collapsed bookshelf that blocked access to the hallway leading to the bedrooms. "Mi hija! Mi esposa!" Rodriguez shouted when he spotted Frank, his eyes wide with terror. His hands were already bloody and burned, leaving crimson smears on the charred wood as he struggled in vain to lift the heavy oak shelving unit. Frank hobbled forward, the heat already raising blisters on his exposed arms. Together they tried to shift the massive piece of furniture, but it was wedged tightly against both walls of the narrow corridor. "Kitchen!" Rodriguez gasped between coughs, pointing toward the back of the apartment. "There's another way." The explosion knocked them both off their feet. The pressure wave slammed Frank against the wall, his cane clattering away across the floor. A fireball erupted from the kitchen. The gas line, Frank realized dimly as he struggled to right himself. Through watery eyes, he saw Rodriguez sprawled halfway across the room, moaning but unmoving, a nasty gash across his forehead pouring blood. "Rodriguez!" Frank called but got no coherent response. The man's eyes were unfocused, his movements sluggish. Concussion, probably. Frank surveyed the apartment, calculating options that dwindled with each passing second. The front door remained accessible, but the hallway to the bedrooms was still blocked. The kitchen route was now an inferno. Emily's cries had grown weaker, punctuated by the mother's increasingly desperate calls for help. No choice. Frank dragged himself toward the blockage, abandoning his cane, using the wall for support. The fallen bookshelf had created a partial barricade. If he could just push it enough to create a gap. Frank planted his good leg and pressed his shoulder against the heavy oak, pushing with everything he had. Nothing. He adjusted his position, ignoring the screaming pain from his bad knee, and pushed again, muscles straining, tendons threatening to snap. The shelf moved an inch, then another. Frank's vision narrowed to a pinpoint, his entire existence focused on this single task. The pain in his knee exploded as something tore, but he didn't stop. Another inch. He could hear Emily's mother coughing violently now, her calls for help becoming weaker. With a final surge of effort that sent white-hot agony up his leg, Frank created a gap barely wide enough for his thin frame. He squeezed through, feeling splinters tear at his skin, and stumbled down the smoke-filled hallway, crawling the last few feet to the bedroom door. Inside, Mrs. Rodriguez had pulled Emily under a small desk in the corner, covering the child's body with her own. Both were conscious, but barely, the mother's eyes glazed with tears and smoke irritation. "Come," Frank rasped, his throat raw. "Ahora. Now." The woman nodded weakly, pushing Emily toward him. Frank gathered the small girl in his arms, her weight slight but still a challenge for his aging body. She looked up at him through streaming eyes, her face smudged with soot, her breathing shallow and rapid. "My dolly," she wheezed, pointing toward a singed teddy bear near the bed. "No time," Frank said, already turning toward the door. "Your mama will get it later." He led Mrs. Rodriguez back into the hallway, the smoke now so thick he could barely see 3 feet ahead. The gap in the bookshelf seemed to have narrowed somehow, but he managed to pass Emily through first, then helped the disoriented mother squeeze past. Frank was halfway through himself when the world exploded in pain and darkness. Something massive crashed into his shoulder from above, a section of the ceiling he realized dimly through a haze of agony. The impact drove him to his knees, pinning him half in and half out of the passage. "Go," he shouted to Mrs. Rodriguez, who had turned back for him. Emily clutched to her chest. "Get out now!" The flames were spreading faster now, feeding on the fresh oxygen from the partially cleared pathway. Frank could feel the heat blistering his back, the smoke choking what little breath remained in his lungs. With a surge of desperate strength, he wrenched himself forward, feeling something tear in his shoulder as he broke free of the debris. The living room was nearly unrecognizable now, engulfed in flames that danced along the ceiling. The front door seemed miles away, through the hellish landscape. Frank staggered forward, one hand guiding Mrs. Rodriguez, the other trying to shield his face from the intensifying heat. Mr. Rodriguez was on his feet now, stumbling toward them from near the door, his silhouette wavering through the flames. Frank pushed the mother and child toward him, then felt his legs finally give way. He collapsed to his knees, then pitched forward onto his hands, coughing violently as his lungs fought for clean air. The path to the door was blocked now by a fallen, burning beam. He could see the Rodriguez family on the other side, framed in the doorway, neighbors' hands reaching in to pull them to safety. But between Frank and that exit was a curtain of flame that his damaged body couldn't possibly cross. He looked up, meeting Emily's terrified gaze across the barrier of fire. In that moment, clarity struck him with the force of revelation. He wasn't in Vietnam saving villagers from a burning hamlet. This time, he had a second chance to do the right thing, even if it meant not making it out alive. Determination flooded through him, pushing back the pain and fear. Frank turned, scanning the apartment through stinging eyes. The window. It was their only chance now. He began crawling toward it, each movement an exercise in pure will as his body screamed for surrender. Outside, sirens wailed closer. Neighbors shouted encouragement through the window. Frank pulled himself up against the wall, gasping as his fingers found the latch. The glass was hot enough to blister his palms, but he wrenched the window open, feeling the blessed rush of cool night air. "Here!" he called out, his voice barely a rasp now. "Help!" Hands reached up from below. Someone had placed a ladder against the building. Frank could see Mrs. Patel and several other neighbors forming a human chain, ready to help. With the last of his strength, he lifted himself onto the windowsill, half falling toward the waiting arms below as the room behind him surrendered, completely, to the flames. As darkness crept in from the edges of his vision, Frank heard the Rodriguez family calling his name, saw the flashing lights of emergency vehicles, felt gentle hands lowering him onto something soft. But as consciousness faded, it wasn't their grateful faces that filled his mind, but the accusing eyes of a Vietnamese child he couldn't save decades ago. White ceiling tiles swam into focus as Frank's eyes fluttered open. The antiseptic smell hit him first, then the steady electronic beeping somewhere to his right. Hospital. The realization came with a wave of disorientation, followed immediately by searing pain across his back and shoulder. A groan escaped his cracked lips. "About time," came a familiar voice. Frank turned his head slightly, wincing at the movement. Thomas sat in a vinyl chair beside the bed, dark circles under his eyes, his normally neat hair disheveled. Frank's son looked like he'd aged 5 years since their last awkward dinner 3 months ago. "Water," Frank managed to rasp. Thomas stood, poured from a pink plastic pitcher and held the cup to Frank's lips. The cool liquid was heavenly against his scorched throat. "How long?" Frank asked after a few careful sips. 2 days, Thomas replied, setting the cup down. "You've been in and out. More out than in." He paused, studying his father with an expression Frank couldn't quite read. "They're calling you a hero, Dad. The whole Rodriguez family made it out thanks to you." Frank closed his eyes. The memories came in disjointed flashes. The heat, the smoke, Emily's terrified face, the window, hands reaching up through darkness. "Not a hero," he mumbled. "Just there. Well, the mayor disagrees. He wants to hold a public ceremony once you're well enough." Frank's eyes snapped open, heart suddenly hammering against his ribs. The monitor beside him reflected the spike, its steady rhythm accelerating to a frantic pace. "No," he said, trying to sit up despite the pain that tore through his upper body. "No ceremonies, no cameras." "Dad, calm down." Thomas placed a restraining hand on his father's uninjured arm. "You'll tear your skin grafts." Before Frank could respond, the door swung open and a white-coated doctor strode in, clipboard in hand. She was middle-aged, with prematurely gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. "Mr. Miller, good to see you awake. I'm Dr. Kapoor." She approached the bed, eyes darting to the monitor. "Though I'd appreciate if you'd keep your heart rate in double digits." She examined him efficiently, explaining his injuries in clinical terms that Frank only half absorbed. Second-degree burns across 15% of his body, primarily back and right shoulder, smoke inhalation exacerbating his already compromised lung function, torn ligaments in his bad knee, possible concussion from the falling debris. "You'll need at least a week here before we can consider release," she concluded, making a note on her clipboard. "And that's assuming no complications." "The ceremony is in 6 days," Thomas interjected. Dr. Kapoor raised an eyebrow. "What ceremony?" "There isn't going to be any ceremony," Frank said flatly. Thomas sighed. "The mayor is recognizing Dad for saving the Rodriguez family." "Well, Dr. Kapoor said after a moment. "We'll see how your recovery progresses, Mr. Miller. Right now, rest is your priority." After she left, an uncomfortable silence settled between father and son. Frank stared at the ceiling, trying to ignore the persistent throbbing across his back and the tightness in his chest that wasn't entirely from smoke damage. "I should go," Thomas finally said, collecting his jacket. "I've got a meeting I can't miss. Laura's bringing the kids by tonight. They've been worried." Frank nodded, not trusting himself to speak. His relationship with his grandchildren was better than the one he had with Thomas, but still distant. His own fault, he knew. "The nurses have my number if you need anything," Thomas added from the doorway, hesitating. "And Dad, what you did was brave, whether you want recognition or not." Alone, Frank drifted in and out of a restless doze, his dreams a confused tangle of burning villages and falling debris. Somewhere in the haze, a child screamed. Emily Rodriguez or the Vietnamese girl from the village near Khe Sanh, he couldn't tell anymore. He was running toward the sound, but his legs moved as if through deep mud, each step slower than the last. "You should have tried harder." Frank jerked awake, gasping to find an elderly nurse checking his IV. Her eyes widened slightly at his reaction. "Sorry to startle you," she said. "Just checking your fluids." Frank struggled to slow his breathing, to separate dream from reality. The nurse's face held a hint of familiarity, though he couldn't place her. She worked efficiently, adjusting his pillows and checking the bandages across his shoulder. "Do I know you?" Frank asked, his voice still rough from smoke and sleep. She studied him for a moment. "I'm not sure," she replied, her tone considering. "But you look familiar, too." She completed her tasks, then hesitated before leaving. From her pocket, she withdrew a small object and placed it on his bedside table. "This might help you sleep." After she left, Frank reached for the object with his good arm. It was a small military pin, tarnished with age but unmistakable. Infantry insignia from the Vietnam era. He stared at it, confused, until exhaustion pulled him back under. The next morning brought a stream of hospital staff and a visit from Thomas, who brought Frank's reading glasses and the book he'd been reading before the fire. Frank asked about the Rodriguez family, but Thomas had little information beyond that they were staying with relatives while their apartment was assessed for damage. "There's a reporter from the Chronicle who wants to interview you," Thomas said, scrolling through messages on his phone. "And the local news station. I told them you're not up for visitors yet." "Good," Frank muttered. "Keep it that way." The day crawled by in a haze of pain, medication, and fitful sleep. Frank refused to turn on the television in his room, even when a nurse mentioned there was coverage of the fire. In the afternoon, a hospital volunteer brought a message that the Rodriguez family wished to visit, which Frank declined, claiming fatigue. "You can't avoid them forever," Thomas pointed out during his evening visit. "They want to thank you." "Nothing to thank me for," Frank replied, shifting uncomfortably against his pillows. "Anyone would have done the same." Thomas gave him a long look. "But they didn't, Dad. You did." Frank changed the subject, asking about Thomas's work, his wife, the grandkids, anything to steer away from the fire and what came after. As Thomas talked about his oldest daughter's college applications, Frank noticed a man pause in the hallway outside his room, glancing in with a nod before continuing on. 20 minutes later, it happened again. Another older man, different face, but the same respectful acknowledgement. By evening, Frank had counted 6 such visitors, none entering his room but all clearly there to see him. When he mentioned it to the night nurse, she shrugged. "Word gets around. There's a veterans ward on the 3rd floor. Guess they heard about you." The next morning, Thomas arrived looking more irritated than usual. He tossed a folded newspaper onto Frank's bed tray. "They ran the story anyway," he said. "Some neighbor gave them your name." Frank left the paper untouched. I don't want to see it. This might actually be a good opportunity, Thomas pressed on, ignoring his father's scowl. Have you thought more about moving to Willow Creek, the assisted living facility I told you about? I'm not going to a home, Frank said flatly. It's not a home, Dad. It's independent living with support services, and this incident proves my point. You shouldn't be living alone anymore. Frank felt a surge of anger, hot and clarifying. This incident proves I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself and others. By nearly dying in a fire? Great argument. I didn't ask for your opinion on where I should live, Frank snapped. I've been making my own decisions since before you were born. Yeah, and look how well that's worked out, Thomas shot back. Alone in that crappy apartment, no friends, barely speaking to your family. You don't know the first thing about my life, Frank interrupted, his voice low and dangerous, because you never let anyone in. Thomas stood abruptly, raking a hand through his hair. God, this is pointless. I took time off work to be here, but you're as stubborn and closed off as ever. No one asked you to come, Frank said, the words out before he could stop them. Thomas stared at him for a long moment, jaw clenched. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew an envelope, tossing it onto the bed. From the mayor's office. They need your answer by tomorrow. He turned and walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. You know, Dad, some people would be grateful for recognition, for family who care. But you push away anything good that comes your way. I don't know why I keep trying. After Thomas left, Frank lay in silence, the anger draining away, leaving only a hollow ache in his chest that had nothing to do with his injuries. He didn't touch the envelope, nor the newspaper that had slid partially off the bed tray. Later, when darkness had fallen and the hospital quieted for the night, Frank found himself unable to sleep. The pain in his back had intensified, and memories he'd suppressed for decades bubbled to the surface like corpses rising in a flood. He remembered the day he'd returned from Vietnam. No welcoming committee, just a gauntlet of protesters at the airport, faces twisted with hatred. Baby killer, they'd called him. One woman had spat in his face. He'd wiped it off and kept walking, still in uniform, still believing that eventually people would understand, would recognize the sacrifice, if not the cause. But the country had wanted to forget, to move on, to bury not just the war, but the warriors. Frank had learned to hide his service, to avoid questions about the gap in his employment history. He'd lost jobs when employers discovered his past, had seen the way people looked at him change when they learned he'd been over there. By the time public sentiment shifted, by the time Vietnam veterans began receiving belated recognition, Frank had built his walls too high to come out from behind them. He'd stopped attending VA meetings, declined invitations to memorial dedications. He'd chosen isolation over the possibility of rejection. And now, after all these years, they wanted to put him on a stage and call him a hero. The irony was almost too much to bear. Frank turned his head to stare out the window at the night sky, barely visible beyond the parking lot lights. A nurse had left a small TV remote within reach, and after a moment's hesitation, he turned on the set, keeping the volume low. He flipped channels aimlessly until a familiar building appeared on screen. His apartment complex, cordoned off with yellow tape, the Rodriguez's unit a blackened scar on the facade. Frank's finger hovered over the button to change the channel, but he stopped when the camera panned to show a small vigil gathered below. Candles, flowers, a hand-lettered sign thanking the hero of apartment 4B. Frank switched off the TV, his throat tight. He reached for the water cup, and his hand brushed against the newspaper Thomas had left. Reluctantly, he unfolded it. The headline made him wince. Vietnam vet becomes local hero. But it was the smaller article below the fold that caught his eye. Fire investigation reveals electrical cause. Frank read the short piece with growing horror. Investigators had determined the fire started due to an electrical short in a makeshift adaptation that powered medical equipment for the Rodriguez's daughter. An adaptation that Frank himself had installed months ago when the family couldn't afford an electrician. The nurse entered his room, finding him with the evidence in his hands. She recognized Frank from somewhere, but couldn't quite place where. She left a small military pin beside his bed without explanation. Frank noticed that other veterans on the same floor of the hospital began to pass by his room, nodding respectfully, as if part of a silent conspiracy. The newspaper slipped from Frank's trembling fingers, landing on the sterile hospital sheets. The evidence stared back at him, incontrovertible. His makeshift electrical fix, the one he'd been so proud of, the one that had saved the Rodriguez family hundreds of dollars they couldn't afford, had been the very thing that nearly killed them all. Frank closed his eyes, his chest tightening in a way that had nothing to do with smoke inhalation. Every burned face from his nightmares, Vietnamese villagers, American soldiers, and now Emily Rodriguez, merged into a single accusatory visage. He'd spent decades running from guilt, only to create a fresh hell for himself. A soft knock interrupted his spiraling thoughts. Expecting another nurse, Frank opened his eyes to find Mr. Rodriguez standing hesitantly in the doorway, his normally cheerful face drawn and exhausted. Bandages wrapped his hands, and a butterfly closure held together a nasty cut on his forehead. "Mr. Miller," Rodriguez said, his accent thickening with emotion. "They told me you were not accepting visitors, but I—" He trailed off, shifting uncomfortably. Frank struggled to sit up straighter, wincing as pain flared across his back. "Mr. Rodriguez, how's your family? Emily?" "They are okay, thanks to you." Rodriguez took a tentative step into the room, clutching a manila envelope in his bandaged hands. "My wife wanted to come, but Emily, she's having nightmares." Frank nodded, understanding too well. "She'll need to talk to someone about that. Don't let her keep it inside." Rodriguez approached the bed, his expression changing from gratitude to something more complicated. "I need to show you this," he said, opening the envelope and extracting several papers. "The insurance company, they are saying they will not cover anything." Frank's stomach dropped. "What? Why not?" "Because of this." Rodriguez handed him a form with sections highlighted in angry yellow. "They say the fire was caused by improper electrical modifications, not up to code. They call it negligence." Frank felt the blood drain from his face as he skimmed the document. "Where are you staying now?" "A shelter on Westmoreland. It's temporary, but—" Rodriguez looked down at his bandaged hands. "Without insurance money, we cannot afford another apartment. The deposit, first month's rent." He shook his head. "And Emily's treatments, her special equipment, was all destroyed." Frank's mind raced. The newspaper article had only mentioned electrical cause, not specifically his improvised wiring job. Had Rodriguez connected those dots yet? "Has the fire investigator spoken with you directly?" Frank asked carefully. Rodriguez nodded. "Yesterday. He asked many questions about the apartment, about who had access. He wanted to know about the equipment for Emily." He hesitated. "I told him you had helped us set it up." So there it was. Frank's guilt must have shown on his face because Rodriguez quickly added, "I did not blame you, Mr. Miller. You were only trying to help. We could not afford the electrician they wanted us to hire." Frank's throat tightened. "It's my fault, Rodriguez. I thought I knew what I was doing. In the Army, we learned to improvise with electrical systems, but that was a long time ago." No, do not say this." Rodriguez stepped closer to the bed. "You saved our lives. The fire, it was an accident. Bad luck." "Bad luck doesn't hold up in court," Frank said grimly, thinking of insurance companies and their armies of lawyers. Or with insurance companies. Rodriguez's shoulders slumped further. "I do not know what to do. Without that money, without a home, he gestured helplessly. Emily needs stability, her treatments, her special bed. Frank stared at the ceiling, mind working. The mayor's ceremony suddenly took on new significance. Maybe there was a way to use this unwanted attention for something worthwhile. Thomas, Frank said abruptly. My son. We might be able to help. For the first time in years, Frank reached for his phone and called his son instead of waiting for Thomas to check in on him. I need you, Frank said simply when Thomas answered, surprised at the unfamiliar words in his mouth. And I need a favor. Thomas arrived an hour later, wary curiosity on his face as he entered the hospital room to find his father and a bandaged stranger engaged in intense conversation. Thomas, this is Mr. Rodriguez, Frank said. Our building caught fire because of electrical work I did for his family. Now the insurance company is denying them coverage. Thomas blinked, processing this information with the same analytical expression he used in his corporate law practice. Wait, you caused the fire? Inadvertently, Frank admitted. I was trying to help. Thomas ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so reminiscent of his childhood frustration that Frank nearly smiled despite the circumstances. Jesus, Dad, you could be liable for... I know, Frank cut him off. But that's not the point right now. This family needs help. Thomas looked between the two men, lawyer brain visibly calculating risks and obligations. What exactly are you proposing? The ceremony, Frank said. The one I didn't want. We use it. Use it. For publicity. For fundraising. Frank leaned forward despite the pain in his back. Your firm does pro bono work, right? Challenge the insurance company's denial. And meanwhile, we set up a donation campaign for the Rodriguez family, launched at the ceremony. Thomas stared at his father as if he'd grown a second head. You want to go on stage? In front of cameras, you? Not want to, Frank corrected. Need to. For the next hour, they outlined a plan. Thomas would contact colleagues who specialized in insurance disputes. Frank would accept the mayor's invitation, with conditions. Rodriguez provided details about their situation, his voice gaining strength as hope began to replace resignation. By the time Rodriguez left, promised updates from Thomas in hand, Frank felt exhausted but purposeful in a way he hadn't experienced in decades. You know, Thomas said after Rodriguez departed, I've spent 15 years trying to get you involved in community events. All it took was accidentally burning down a building? Frank shot him a withering look, but there was no real heat behind it. I need you to contact some people for me. Old friends. From the service? Frank nodded. The local VFW chapter, the Vietnam Veterans Group that meets at the community center. Tell them Frank Miller is finally calling in some favors. Thomas raised an eyebrow but wrote down the information Frank recited from memory. You sure about this, Dad? Once you step into the spotlight... I've been invisible for a long time, Frank interrupted. Maybe too long. After Thomas left, Frank spent the afternoon preparing for what lay ahead. He requested extra physical therapy sessions, determined to be strong enough to stand without assistance during the ceremony. He drafted notes for a speech, words that had been locked inside him for decades, finally finding their way to paper. Dr. Kapoor was skeptical about his plan to leave the hospital for the ceremony, but Frank's stubborn determination eventually wore her down to a conditional approval. He would need to return immediately after, and a medical professional would accompany him. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation, interrupted by bouts of pain and moments of doubt that Frank pushed through with grim determination. Thomas reported promising developments. His firm was interested in the insurance case, and several veterans groups had expressed enthusiastic support for the fundraising plan. On the 4th day, Frank finally felt strong enough to attempt walking farther than the bathroom. With a physical therapist hovering nearby, he made his way slowly down the hospital corridor, leaning heavily on a walker. Mr. Miller, a voice called from behind. Frank turned carefully to see a nurse hurrying toward him, a cell phone in hand. "Your son asked me to give you this urgent message." The text from Thomas was brief, but devastating. "Mayor's office denied permission for fundraising at ceremony. Says it politicizes a celebration of heroism. Call me." Frank's hands tightened on the walker. Politics. Always politics. His therapist noticed his elevated breathing and suggested they return to his room, but Frank shook his head and continued his painful progress down the hallway, mind racing. By evening, his resolve had hardened. If the system wouldn't accommodate their needs, they would work around it. He called Thomas. "Find Rodriguez," he instructed. "Tell him to meet us at the shelter tonight." "Dad, you can't leave the hospital." "I'm not asking permission," Frank said with a finality that silenced his son's objections. Hours later, against medical advice but with Thomas's reluctant assistance, Frank sat in a wheelchair in the community room of the Westmoreland Emergency Shelter. The fluorescent lighting was harsh, the plastic chairs uncomfortable, but Rodriguez had managed to gather his family and secure some privacy. Frank looked at each of them. Mrs. Rodriguez's tired but dignified face, Emily's curious eyes, Mr. Rodriguez's hopeful expression, and began explaining their revised plan for the ceremony and fundraising efforts. They were deep in discussion when shouting erupted from the main dormitory area. Rodriguez tensed, then excused himself. Frank continued talking with Mrs. Rodriguez, but the shouting grew louder, and within minutes, Rodriguez's voice joined the commotion. Thomas helped Frank maneuver his wheelchair toward the noise. In the dormitory, they found Rodriguez in a heated confrontation with a burly man whose face was flushed with anger. "Taking resources from real Americans," the man was shouting. "Got your whole family in here taking up space." "My children were born here," Rodriguez responded, his normally gentle demeanor replaced with righteous anger. "We lost everything in that fire." "Yeah, well, my tax dollars shouldn't pay for your mistakes, amigo." Frank felt a surge of rage that momentarily eclipsed his pain. Without thinking, he pushed himself up from the wheelchair, ignoring Thomas's alarmed protest. "Hey!" Frank's voice cut through the argument, surprisingly strong. "That's enough." The burly man turned, sizing up the elderly interloper. "Stay out of this, Grandpa." "That man and his family are my neighbors," Frank said, stepping forward despite the agony in his back and knee. "And I won't stand here while you disrespect them." "Dad," Thomas warned, reaching for his arm. The man sneered. "What are you going to do about it, old-timer?" Frank hadn't been in a physical altercation since 1972, but some instincts never fade. When the man stepped aggressively toward him, Frank's muscle memory responded, a swift, precise move to deflect and unbalance his opponent. But his body betrayed him. Pain exploded across his back as the motion pulled at his burns. His bad knee buckled. Instead of executing the defensive maneuver, Frank found himself falling, his vision narrowing to a pinpoint of light surrounded by darkness. Distantly, he heard shouts, felt hands catching him, smelled the antiseptic scent of bandages coming loose. Then nothing. Frank awakened in his hospital bed, Thomas's worried face swimming into focus above him. Dr. Kapoor stood at the foot of the bed, her expression a mixture of professional concern and personal disapproval. "You've torn open your skin grafts," she informed him coldly. "Set back your recovery by days, if not weeks." "What were you thinking?" Frank tried to speak but found his throat too dry. Thomas offered water through a straw. "The ceremony," Frank managed after swallowing, "is tomorrow," Thomas finished, "and you're not going anywhere." Frank closed his eyes in defeat. Everything had been planned around his appearance at that podium. The veterans groups were mobilized. Thomas had media contacts ready to publicize the Rodriguez family's situation. Without him there to serve as the focal point, it would all fall apart. "There's more," Thomas said quietly. "I saw it on the news while you were unconscious. They've expanded the ceremony. It's not just about you anymore." Frank opened his eyes. What do you mean? Thomas turned on the small television and flipped to a local news channel. A reporter stood in front of City Hall, explaining excitedly that tomorrow's ceremony would now include a special recognition of all Vietnam veterans, using Mr. Miller's heroic actions as a symbol of their enduring service and sacrifice. Frank stared at the screen in horror, his worst fear realized, his personal story being co-opted, used as a political tool, exactly the kind of exploitation he'd always dreaded. The television flickered with images of politicians posing before podiums, their rehearsed sincerity making Frank's stomach turn. He grabbed the remote and hit the power button, plunging the room into blessed silence. "They're using me," he muttered, the realization settling like a stone in his chest. "Using all of us. Again." Thomas stood by the window, silhouetted against the evening sky. "I tried calling the mayor's office again. They won't budge on the fundraising ban." Frank shifted against his pillows, wincing as the movement pulled at his freshly re-bandaged burns. The clock on the wall showed nearly 7 p.m., less than 18 hours until the ceremony that was growing more elaborate by the minute, all without his consent. "Show me that headline again," Frank said. Thomas hesitated, then retrieved his tablet, opening the local news site. The bold text proclaimed, "Ceremony for local hero transforms into national event with political attendance." Frank read the article carefully this time, noting the guest list. The mayor, 2 congressmen, a senator's representative, all describing how they would honor America's forgotten heroes and recognize the ongoing sacrifices of Vietnam veterans. His personal story, his private act of courage, had been transformed overnight into a political spectacle. "They don't care about the Rodriguez family," Frank said finally. "They don't even care about veterans. They care about photo ops and voter approval ratings." Thomas sighed, setting the tablet aside. "You're not wrong. But what can we do now? You're confined to this bed. The ceremony is tomorrow, and Rodriguez needs help, not political statements." Frank tapped his fingers against the blanket, mind racing despite the fog of pain medication. "Call Susan," he said suddenly. "The nurse? Why?" "Her brother, the photojournalist I apparently saved a lifetime ago. He might be our way to get the real story out." While Thomas made the call, Frank stared at the ceiling, mentally revising their strategy. If he couldn't physically attend the ceremony, perhaps there was still a way to make his voice heard and to help the Rodriguez family in the process. Susan arrived during evening rounds, slipping into Frank's room after her official duties were complete. Her brother James, the photojournalist, accompanied her, a tall, lean man with watchful eyes and silver-streaked hair. "So you're the guy who pulled me out of that rice paddy," James said, studying Frank's face. "Carried me half a mile to the medevac under sniper fire. I always wondered if I'd recognize you if we met again." Frank shook his head. "I don't remember specific faces, just doing what needed doing." "Well, I remember yours," James replied. "Hard to forget the face of the man who gives you a second chance at life." The conversation shifted to their current predicament. James listened intently as Thomas outlined the situation with the Rodriguez family, the insurance denial, and the politically hijacked ceremony. "Politicians co-opting veterans' stories for their own gain? I'm shocked. Shocked, I tell you," James said dryly. "But I might be able to help. I've still got contacts at several major outlets." "We need to redirect attention to the Rodriguez family's situation," Frank explained. "The insurance company denying their claim, the reality of what happens after the cameras leave, and the heroes are forgotten." James nodded, already making notes on his phone. "A counter-narrative to the political pageantry. Focus on the real aftermath, the human cost." He looked up. "But it would be more powerful coming from you directly, Frank." "That's the problem," Thomas interjected. "He's physically unable to attend." James studied Frank for a long moment. Who says you need to be there physically to make an impact? By midnight, they had cobbled together a plan. James would attend the ceremony as press, positioned to capture key moments. Susan, off duty tomorrow, would help Frank record a statement that James would ensure reached the right outlets at the right time. Thomas would coordinate with local veterans groups to create a presence at the ceremony that couldn't be ignored. Get some rest, Susan advised as they prepared to leave. Tomorrow will be challenging enough without exhaustion, complicating your recovery. But sleep eluded Frank. His mind kept returning to the Rodriguez family, wondering how they were coping in that sterile shelter with its fluorescent lights and lack of privacy. He thought of Emily, whose medical equipment had been destroyed in the fire, equipment he had tried to help with, inadvertently causing the disaster. The guilt was a physical presence, heavy on his chest, restricting his breathing more effectively than the smoke damage. At dawn, Frank was already awake when Dr. Kapoor arrived for early rounds. She examined his re-bandaged burns with a critical eye. The tearing isn't as severe as I initially feared, she admitted. But you're still not leaving this hospital today. Wasn't planning to, Frank replied, surprising her. I've got other ideas. Thomas arrived at 8 a.m., carrying Frank's least-worn button-up shirt and a small digital camera. Susan followed shortly after, officially off duty, but still wearing her hospital ID badge that gave her access to all areas. James is already at City Hall, she reported. The place is crawling with security and media. Your veterans' friends are gathering too. Quite a turnout, actually. Frank nodded, feeling a surge of camaraderie with men he hadn't spoken to in years. Veterans understood each other in ways civilians never could, shared a bond that transcended time and personal differences. With Susan's help, Frank managed to get dressed and positioned in a chair near the window, where the natural light would serve their purposes. The effort left him sweating and lightheaded, but he refused additional pain medication that might cloud his thinking. Ready? Thomas asked, setting up the camera on a makeshift tripod. Frank took a deep breath, ignoring the burning in his lungs. Ready? For the next hour, they recorded Frank's statement in segments, allowing him to rest between takes. He spoke directly to the camera, his voice stronger than any of them expected, fueled by conviction and decades of suppressed truths. He explained how the fire started, taking full responsibility for the faulty wiring. He described the insurance company's denial of the Rodriguez claim. Most powerfully, he drew parallels between how America treated its veterans after Vietnam and how it treated families like the Rodriguez now, with grand public gestures masking private abandonment. We celebrate heroes when it's convenient, Frank said in the final segment, looking directly into the lens. When their stories can be useful. But true heroism isn't about medals or ceremonies. It's about what happens afterward, how we care for each other when the cameras are gone. The Rodriguez family needs our help now, not our applause. By the time they finished, Frank was exhausted, pain radiating across his back and chest. Susan helped him back to bed while Thomas transferred the footage to his phone and sent it to James. Now we wait, Thomas said, checking his watch. The ceremony was scheduled to begin at noon. Frank closed his eyes, suddenly bone-tired. Wake me when there's news. He drifted in and out of consciousness, dreams mixing with memories. He was back in the village near Khe San, carrying a wounded child through smoke-filled huts. But the child's face kept changing. Sometimes a Vietnamese girl, sometimes Emily Rodriguez. In the dream, Frank could never reach safety, the helicopter always just beyond reach, taking off without them. Dad! Thomas's voice pulled him from the nightmare. It's starting. Frank blinked awake to see Thomas pointing at the television, now tuned to a local station broadcasting live from the ceremony. The camera panned across an impressive crowd gathered before City Hall, American flags fluttering in the spring breeze. The mayor stood at a podium festooned with patriotic bunting, his practiced smile gleaming as he spoke about everyday heroes and the spirit of America. "Where are the Rodriguez family?" Frank asked, scanning the crowd. "Front row," Thomas pointed. James made sure they had prominent seats. Indeed, the camera briefly showed the family sitting uncomfortably in folding chairs, looking overwhelmed by the spectacle. Emily clutched her mother's hand, eyes wide at the surrounding commotion. The mayor was introducing dignitaries now, each taking a moment at the microphone to express admiration for Frank's bravery and, increasingly, to make broader statements about patriotism and service that had little to do with the actual events of the fire. "And while we regret that Mr. Miller's health prevents him from joining us today," the mayor continued smoothly, "his absence reminds us of the real sacrifices made by our—" A commotion interrupted his speech. The camera swung to capture a group of veterans, many in their 60s and 70s like Frank, some wearing pieces of old uniforms, moving toward the front of the crowd. They formed a line facing the stage, silent but impossible to ignore. The mayor faltered, then attempted to incorporate this unplanned development into his remarks. "And here, indeed, are some of Mr. Miller's fellow veterans, joining us in solidarity. We're not here for your speech," called out a gray-haired man Frank recognized as Mike Donnelly, once his platoon's radio man. "We're here for Frank, and for that family." He pointed to the Rodriguezes. The camera caught the mayor's frozen smile, the uncertain glances between officials on stage. Then James appeared in frame, press credentials visible around his neck, approaching the microphone with the confident stride of someone accustomed to inserting himself into tense situations. "If I may," James said, not actually waiting for permission, "I have a statement from Frank Miller himself, recorded this morning." Before anyone could object, James held up his tablet. Frank's face appeared on the large screen that had been set up beside the stage, initially startling the crowd into silence. The statement played in its entirety, Frank's unvarnished words cutting through the ceremony's carefully orchestrated messaging. The camera captured the shifting expressions of the politicians as Frank spoke about responsibility, about the insurance company's denial, about the gap between public celebration and private abandonment. When Frank's recorded image spoke directly about the Rodriguez family's plight, the IE camera panned to show their reaction. Mrs. Rodriguez wiping tears, Mr. Rodriguez sitting straighter, chin raised with restored dignity. As the statement concluded, the veterans who had positioned themselves at the front began a slow, deliberate applause that spread gradually through the crowd. The politicians on stage had no choice but to join in, their expressions a study in controlled discomfort. "It's working," Thomas murmured, watching the coverage intently. "They can't ignore this now." Frank allowed himself a small smile, the first in days. "James knows what he's doing." The ceremony continued, but the tone had irrevocably shifted. The mayor, attempting to regain control, announced that the city would look into the insurance situation and pledged to explore options for temporary housing assistance. "Politicians speak for damage control," Thomas translated. The broadcast eventually cut away from the ceremony to the studio, where anchors began discussing the developing situation with barely concealed excitement. Thomas's phone chimed repeatedly with incoming messages. "The local VA office is calling," he reported, scanning texts. "And the insurance commissioner's office. James says reporters are swarming the mayor with questions about specific plans to help the Rodriguez family." Frank leaned back against his pillows, a curious lightness replacing the weight that had pressed on his chest for days. For years, perhaps. Whether anything concrete would come from this moment remained to be seen, but something had shifted, both in the public narrative and within himself. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Frank looked up to see Mr. Rodriguez standing in the doorway, still dressed in the clean but well-worn clothes he'd worn to the ceremony, an unfolded piece of paper clutched in his bandaged hands. "Mr. Miller," he said, his expression unreadable. The mayor asked me to deliver this to you personally." Frank stared at the folded paper in Mr. Rodriguez's hand, sensing bad news in the way the man's fingers trembled slightly. The overhead fluorescent lights accentuated the exhaustion etched into Rodriguez's face. "Come in," Frank said, gesturing to the chair beside his bed. Rodriguez crossed the threshold hesitantly, as if entering a confession booth rather than a hospital room. He remained standing, turning the paper over in his bandaged hands. "The ceremony," Frank asked. "How did it end after the broadcast cut away?" "Confusion," Rodriguez answered simply. "Many reporters asking questions. The mayor speaking with veterans. My wife took Emily back to the shelter. It was too much for her." He paused, his gaze dropping to the paper he held. "Then the mayor asked me to bring you this." Frank took the offered document, recognizing the city letterhead immediately. As he unfolded it, Rodriguez remained silent, shifting his weight uncomfortably from one foot to another. It wasn't a thank you note or an official commendation as Frank had half expected. It was a legal notice, a formal documentation from the insurance company's attorney, addressed to both Frank and Rodriguez. The language was couched in legalese, but the message was unmistakable. The insurance company was pursuing full investigation of the unauthorized electrical modifications and considering legal action against both parties for potential code violations. "Jesus," Frank muttered, folding the paper again. "I'm sorry, Rodriguez. This is becoming a bigger mess by the day." "I did not want to sue you," Rodriguez said quickly, his voice strained. "The insurance company's lawyers, they say I must identify who did the wiring or they will deny everything. I told them it was a favor to help Emily's equipment." He trailed off, gesturing helplessly. The door opened again, and Thomas walked in, stopping short when he saw Rodriguez. "Mr. Rodriguez, I didn't know you'd be here." His eyes darted to the folded paper in Frank's hand. "What's that?" Frank handed the notice to his son, watching Thomas's expression darken as he read. The corporate lawyer emerged immediately in his posture, in the calculated narrowing of his eyes. "This is intimidation tactics," Thomas said flatly. "They're panicking after the publicity at the ceremony." Rodriguez sank into the chair beside Frank's bed, the weight of everything finally overcoming his resolve to remain standing. "What do we do now? My family cannot stay in the shelter much longer. Emily needs her treatments, her special equipment." Frank looked between Rodriguez and his son, seeing the problem from both perspectives, the desperate father and the calculating legal mind. He felt a strange sense of clarity cutting through his pain medication fog. "We fight," Frank said simply. "We were going to anyway, but now they've shown their hand. They're scared." Thomas nodded slowly. "I can have our litigation team look at this immediately. They're overreaching, hoping to scare you into silence." Rodriguez looked unconvinced. "But they are right. The wiring was not official, not up to code, as they say." "Maybe not," Frank admitted. "But they're ignoring their responsibility to cover legitimate losses, regardless of contributing factors. And more importantly, they're hoping the story goes away." Frank shifted in his bed, suppressing a wince as the movement pulled at his burns. "Thomas, call Susan. See if her brother can follow up with a story about insurance company intimidation. And contact those veterans who showed up today. We need to keep momentum going." For the first time since he'd entered the room, Rodriguez's expression lightened slightly. "The veterans at the ceremony, they came to me afterward. Many offered help. One man said he is an electrician, another works in construction. They want to rebuild, to help us." This information hit Frank like a physical force. He'd lived so long in isolation that he'd forgotten the power of shared purpose, of a community rallying around its own. "Good," Frank said, his voice rough with emotion he refused to display. "That's good." Thomas was already on his phone, texting rapidly. "James is all over it. He's meeting us here in an hour with Susan. He looked up. But Dad, you need to understand, this could escalate. You could be facing actual liability here, maybe even criminal charges if they push the code violation angle. I'm aware, Frank replied. The possibility of legal consequences had occurred to him the moment he'd read the insurance company's notice. At 68, the prospect of courtrooms and potential financial ruin should have terrified him. Strangely, it didn't. After decades of emotional numbness, even fear felt like a welcome change. Rodriguez cleared his throat. I should go back to my family. Tell them what is happening. He stood, hesitating. Mr. Miller, I want you to know, whatever happens with insurance, with lawyers, you gave my Emily a chance to grow up, to have a future. This debt cannot be repaid with money or words. After Rodriguez left, Thomas sat in the vacated chair, legal pad in hand, already outlining strategy. We need to get ahead of this, he murmured half to himself. Counter their intimidation with public outrage. Maybe file a preliminary injunction. Frank let his son's legal terminology wash over him, his mind traveling back decades to another kind of battle planning, crouched in jungle undergrowth, plotting maneuvers and escape routes on muddy maps. Different terrain, same principles. Identify vulnerabilities, secure your position. Never let the enemy dictate the terms of engagement. What are you thinking? Thomas asked, noticing his father's distant expression. That you fight wars with the army you have, Frank replied, and that sometimes the underdog wins. By evening, Frank's hospital room had transformed into an impromptu command center. Susan and James arrived with coffee and determination, followed by Mike Donnelly from the VFW and two other veterans who'd been part of the ceremony demonstration. Thomas had conference-called colleagues from his law firm who were now reviewing the insurance company's policy language for weaknesses. The local news cycle is hungry for follow-up, James reported, showing them clips on his tablet of various stations covering the ceremony disruption. I've got 3 outlets ready to run pieces on predatory insurance practices using the Rodriguez case as the hook. And I reached out to that nursing home that's been after you to move in, Thomas added. Turns out their parent company sits on the same corporate board as Transcontinental Insurance. They're very interested in helping resolve this unfortunate misunderstanding. Frank nodded, impressed despite himself at his son's strategic thinking. Pressure points. Good. Mike Donnelly, who'd barely spoken since arriving, finally cleared his throat. It's not just about the insurance, though, is it? The former radio man's voice still carried the faint drawl of his Alabama upbringing. It's about what happens to that family even if they get their money. Where do they live, meanwhile? How does the little girl get what she needs? The room fell silent as the immediate practical concerns cut through the strategic planning. Mike's right, Frank said finally. We need parallel tracks. Fight the insurance battle, yes. But the Rodriguez family needs help now. Susan, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. My church has a transitional housing program. It's not perfect, but it's private rooms, not an open shelter. I can make a call. And I know people at 3 different medical supply companies, added one of the other veterans, a former medic named Porter. We might be able to get donated equipment for the girl. The conversation continued, plans building upon plans, each person contributing expertise or connections. Frank found himself watching his son, really seeing him perhaps for the first time in years. Thomas was in his element, organizing information, delegating tasks, building consensus among this disparate group. When had the awkward boy become this capable man? How much had Frank missed by keeping the world at arm's length? A nurse interrupted their strategy session, insisting that Frank needed rest. As the group prepared to leave, making plans to reconvene the following day, Thomas hung back. You should get some sleep, he told his father. Big day tomorrow if we're going to pull all this together. Frank nodded. suddenly aware of the bone-deep exhaustion that had been masked by adrenaline and purpose. "Thomas," he said as his son reached the door, "you're good at this. Better than I would have been." Thomas paused, surprise flickering across his face at the unexpected compliment. "I had a good teacher," he replied after a moment. "You never back down from a fight that matters. I learned that much, at least." After everyone had gone, Frank lay in the darkened room processing the day's events. Something had fundamentally shifted, both around him and within him. The walls he'd spent decades building had been breached, first by smoke and fire, then by unwanted recognition, and finally by the simple realization that isolation was a prison of his own making. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Dr. Kapoor entered, clipboard in hand, expression neutral as she checked his vitals. "Your blood pressure is elevated," she noted. "Pain levels?" "Manageable," Frank answered. Dr. Kapoor raised an eyebrow. "Your room has seen more traffic than the nurses' station today. Perhaps manageable isn't the most accurate assessment." "I've had worse," Frank said simply. The doctor made a notation on her clipboard. "Mr. Miller, as your physician, I should advise you to focus solely on your recovery right now." She paused, then added in a different tone, "As someone who's seen too many insurance companies deny legitimate claims, I might suggest that your current activities are therapeutic in their own way." Frank studied her with new interest. "Speaking from experience, doctor?" "My mother," Dr. Kapoor said after a brief hesitation. "Stroke victim. The insurance company called her rehabilitation not medically necessary after 3 weeks." Her professional demeanor returned quickly. "But that's neither here nor there. You need rest." As she turned to leave, Frank called after her, "Dr. Kapoor, thank you." The following morning brought updates from multiple fronts. James had successfully placed stories about insurance company tactics in several news outlets. Susan's church had approved emergency housing for the Rodriguez family. Thomas's law firm had officially taken on the case pro bono, beginning with a sternly worded response to the insurance company's intimidation attempt. Frank was reviewing this information when Thomas arrived, earlier than expected, and with an intensity that suggested significant news. "What is it?" Frank asked. "I went to the shelter this morning to update Rodriguez on our progress," Thomas explained, pulling up a chair. "But when I got there, he was packing their few belongings. Said he'd been offered a job in Cincinnati with his cousin's landscaping business. They're planning to leave tomorrow." "What?" Frank struggled to sit up straighter. "But all this work, the housing arrangement, the legal strategy—" "That's what I told him," Thomas interjected. "But he's scared, Dad. The shelter director told him the insurance company sent an investigator there, asking questions about their immigration status." Frank's hands clenched into fists. "That's illegal. They can't—" "Of course it's illegal, but it worked. Rodriguez said he can't risk his family getting caught up in immigration issues, even though they're here legally. His work visa renewal is pending, and any complications could jeopardize it." Frank stared at the ceiling, frustration burning in his chest alongside the physical pain. Just when they'd begun to organize, to fight back effectively, the insurance company had found the one pressure point guaranteed to scatter their efforts. "Where is Rodriguez now?" Frank asked. "Still at the shelter, but he's made up his mind. Says they'll leave first thing tomorrow." Frank closed his eyes, thinking. Then he opened them with newfound determination. "Get me out of here." Thomas blinked. "What?" "Get me discharged. Or sign me out AMA, whatever it takes." "Dad, your burns will heal the same whether I'm here or somewhere else," Frank interrupted. "I need to talk to Rodriguez in person, today." Thomas stared at his father, clearly weighing options and risks. "The doctor will never approve discharge." "Then we don't ask for approval," Frank said simply. "This isn't my first extraction operation, son." On the eve of the ceremony, the doctor delivers his final verdict. "I'm sorry, Mr. Miller, but with that pneumonia developing, I cannot authorize your release tomorrow. It would be a serious risk to your life." Frank woke before dawn, the gray light seeping through the hospital blinds matching his determination. On the television mounted in the corner, technicians scurried across the stage at City Hall, preparing for the ceremony that was now just hours away. Frank watched silently as they tested microphones and arranged chairs, constructing the political theater that would exploit his story without him. "Turn that thing off," he muttered to himself, reaching for the remote. The screen went black, but the images remained in his mind. The podium where politicians would stand, the seats where the Rodriguez family would be displayed like props, the space where he was supposed to play the role of grateful hero. Frank shifted in bed, wincing as the movement pulled at his healing burns. Dr. Kapoor had been unequivocal during his final examination the previous evening. "I'm sorry, Mr. Miller, but with that pneumonia developing, I cannot authorize your release tomorrow. It would be a serious risk to your life." The doctor's words should have settled the matter, but as Frank had learned in Vietnam, sometimes the most dangerous path was the only viable one. He hadn't survived jungle warfare by following medical advice. The door opened quietly, and Thomas entered carrying a cardboard cup of coffee, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he'd had little sleep. "You look terrible," Frank observed. Thomas gave a tired smile. "Good morning to you too, Dad." He sank into the visitor's chair. "Susan's shift starts in 20 minutes. She'll bring what we need." Frank nodded, mentally reviewing their improvised plan. After his declaration yesterday that he needed to speak with Rodriguez before the family fled to Cincinnati, Thomas had reluctantly engaged in what his legal mind kept referring to as probably several misdemeanors. The plan was simple in concept. Susan would provide a maintenance worker's uniform and access to service elevators. Thomas would create a diversion to clear their path. They would wheel Frank out through the loading dock, where veterans from yesterday's ceremony would be waiting with transportation. "James has confirmed the Rodriguez family will still be at the shelter until at least noon," Thomas said, scrolling through messages on his phone, "and he'll have a camera crew ready at City Hall for whatever it is you're planning to do." "I'm still working on that part," Frank admitted. Thomas studied his father with an expression Frank couldn't quite read. "You know, most people your age try to avoid stress, not actively seek it out. Yet here you are, planning a hospital breakout to crash a ceremony honoring you, all while recovering from serious injuries." "I've never been good at most people," Frank replied. The door opened again, and Susan slipped in, a bundle tucked under her arm and anxiety evident on her face. "Security's been increased," she reported. "There's a news van outside trying to get footage of you. Hospital. Administration is worried about liability." "More obstacles, same mission," Frank said, the old military pragmatism surfacing. "What's our timeline look like?" Susan unfolded a maintenance uniform on the bed. "Shift change in 15 minutes. That's our window. Most of the administrative staff will be in morning meeting. But Frank..." She hesitated. "Dr. Kapoor wasn't exaggerating about your condition. Your latest chest X-ray shows the pneumonia advancing." Frank waved away her concern. "I've coughed up worse than a little pneumonia." "This isn't a joke," she insisted. "If you leave without proper medical care..." "I'll come back," Frank interrupted, "after I've done what needs doing." Thomas and Susan exchanged looks that Frank pretended not to notice as he slowly swung his legs over the side of the bed. The movement sent fire across his back where the skin grafts were still healing. He closed his eyes briefly, focusing on his breathing, the way he once had while on long-range patrols. Acknowledge the pain, then push it aside. Dressing was an ordeal that left Frank lightheaded and sweating despite the others' help. The maintenance uniform hung loosely on his frame, a reminder of how much weight he'd lost since the fire. Susan provided a hospital ID badge on a lanyard, the photo too small to clearly identify the actual owner. "Remember," Susan said, helping Frank into the wheelchair, "keep your head down when we pass security cameras. If anyone questions us, I'm taking you to repair a plumbing issue in the East Wing." Thomas checked his watch. "I'll head down first. When you hear the code blue announcement, that's your signal to move." He squeezed his father's shoulder gently. "Try not to die, okay? I've already spent too much on hospital parking this week." Frank recognized the gallows humor for what it was, his son's way of managing fear. "No promises," he replied with the ghost of a smile. After Thomas left, Frank and Susan waited in tense silence. Frank focused on controlling his breathing, each inhale bringing a concerning rattle from his chest. Susan pretended to adjust equipment while keeping an eye on the hallway through the cracked door. "Your brother," Frank said suddenly, "the one I pulled out of that rice paddy. He turned out okay?" Susan nodded. 3 Pulitzer nominations, 2 children, 1 divorce. She smiled faintly. "Pretty good life, all things considered." "Good," Frank said. "That's good." The overhead speaker crackled to life. "Code blue, main lobby, code blue, main lobby." "That's us," Susan said, moving behind the wheelchair. "Ready?" Frank nodded, pulling a maintenance cap low over his face. Susan pushed him out into the corridor and toward the service elevator, moving with purposeful speed. They passed a nurse's station where all attention was directed toward the commotion downstairs, staff members speaking hurriedly into phones. The service elevator opened with Susan's badge, its interior untidy and industrial compared to the patient elevators. As they descended to the basement level, Frank felt a strange sense of detachment, as if watching himself from a distance, an old man in borrowed clothes fleeing medical care to fight one more battle. The basement corridor was dimly lit and smelled of industrial cleaners. Susan navigated confidently through a maze of storage areas and maintenance rooms, finally approaching a heavy door marked Loading Dock. "Mike should be waiting with a car," she whispered, pushing through the door. Outside, the morning air hit Frank like a physical force, the first fresh air he'd breathed in nearly a week. The loading dock was relatively quiet, a single delivery truck being unloaded at the far end. Parked near the exit ramp was a battered station wagon, Mike Donnelly at the wheel. Susan wheeled Frank rapidly down the ramp. "Good luck," she said, helping him transfer from the wheelchair to the passenger seat of Mike's car. "Don't make me regret this." "Too late for that," Frank replied, settling painfully into the seat. Mike pulled away from the hospital with deliberate casualness, not speeding but not lingering either. "Just like old times," he commented, navigating toward the main road. "Extraction under fire. Though back then, you were usually the one doing the extracting." Frank grimaced as the car hit a pothole, sending a jolt of pain through his injured back. "Less reminiscing, more driving, Donnelly." In the passenger side mirror, Frank watched the hospital recede into the distance. The enormity of what they were doing, what he was risking, began to settle on him. If the pneumonia worsened, if his burns became infected. But no, those were calculations for later. Right now there was only the mission: reach Rodriguez, prevent the family from leaving, then somehow make it to the ceremony to ensure the politicians couldn't control the narrative. Thomas called as they approached the shelter, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Security noticed you're missing. They're searching the hospital. How far out are you?" "Almost there," Mike answered, the phone on speaker. 5 minutes to the shelter. How's your situation?" "I managed to slip away during the confusion. I'll meet you there." Thomas paused. "Dad, you know this is probably the stupidest thing you've ever done, right?" "Not even in the top 5, Frank replied, before a coughing fit seized him. The Westmoreland Emergency Shelter was housed in a repurposed elementary school, its playground equipment visible but unused behind chain-link fencing. Mike parked in a visitor space, then came around to help Frank from the car. Standing was harder than Frank had anticipated. His legs trembled beneath him and the world tilted alarmingly before steadying. He leaned heavily on Mike's arm, refusing the offer of a wheelchair from the trunk. "I'll walk in on my own 2 feet," Frank insisted, though walking was a generous description of his pained shuffling. Thomas was waiting for them, inside, pacing the small reception area. His expression of relief at seeing them quickly transformed to alarm when he took in his father's condition. "Jesus, Dad, you look like hell, I know." Frank cut him off. "Where's Rodriguez?" The shelter coordinator, a harried-looking woman with a clipboard, initially tried to prevent them from entering the residential section, citing privacy rules. Thomas's legal credentials and Mike's veteran status eventually persuaded her to at least check if Rodriguez would see visitors. While they waited, Frank lowered himself carefully onto a plastic chair, each breath now requiring conscious effort. He could feel fluid gathering in his lungs, the pneumonia tightening its grip. "Maybe we should take you back," Thomas suggested quietly, noting his father's labored breathing. Frank shook his head stubbornly. "Not yet." Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, surprise evident on his tired face. "Mr. Miller, how are you here?" "The hospital. We need to talk," Frank said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. "About Cincinnati." Rodriguez sat reluctantly, glancing toward Thomas as if seeking explanation. "There is nothing to discuss. We leave tomorrow morning. It is better this way." "Better for who?" Frank asked. "The insurance company? The politicians who want to use your story and then forget you?" "Better for my family," Rodriguez replied firmly. "This fight with insurance, the attention, the questions about our status, it is too much risk." Frank leaned forward, despite the pain it caused. "Running won't solve the problem. The insurance company is counting on that. On you being too afraid to stand your ground." "It is easy for you to say," Rodriguez countered, an edge entering his voice. "You are a citizen, a veteran, a hero to them now. My family does not have this privilege." The word hit Frank like a physical blow. Privilege. After decades of feeling forgotten, dismissed by the country he'd served, the concept seemed almost laughable. Yet Rodriguez was right. For all his struggles, Frank had never had to fear deportation, never had to worry that seeking justice might separate him from his family. "You're right," Frank admitted. "I don't know what that's like." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But I do know what it's like to run from a fight that follows you anyway. I've been running since I came home from Vietnam, hiding, pretending the past couldn't touch me. And look where it got me. Alone in that apartment, trying to help your family with electrical work I barely remembered how to do." Rodriguez's expression softened slightly. Frank continued, his voice growing hoarser with each word. "The insurance company sent someone to intimidate you, to make you afraid. Because they know if you stay and fight with all of us behind you, they'll lose." Frank gestured to Thomas. "My son's firm is taking your case pro bono. The veterans groups are mobilized. The media is watching. We have leverage now." "And what about my work visa, my family's security?" Thomas spoke up. "My firm has an excellent immigration department. If the insurance company tries anything related to your status, we'll be ready." Rodriguez looked between them, conflict evident in his expression. Beyond him, Frank could see Mrs. Rodriguez watching from the dormitory entrance, Emily clinging to her hand. "The ceremony is in 2 hours," Frank said, playing his final card. "The mayor, congressmen, cameras, all there to celebrate a rescue that wouldn't have been necessary if I hadn't caused the fire in the first place." He met Rodriguez's gaze directly. "Help me make it right. Not just with words, but with action." Rodriguez was silent for a long moment, seemingly weighing all variables, all risks. Finally, he nodded slowly. "What do you need us to do?" As Mike drove them toward City Hall, Frank's condition deteriorated visibly. His breathing became more labored, his skin ashen beneath the flush of fever. In the back seat, Thomas made phone calls, coordinating with James and the veterans who would meet them there. "Are you sure about this?" Mike asked quietly, glancing at his old comrade. "You look like you might collapse before we even get there." Frank managed a weak smile. "Wouldn't be the first time I completed a mission on my last legs." The car rounded the final corner, bringing City Hall into view. The plaza before it was filled with people, the stage decorated with flags and banners. A podium stood center stage, where the mayor was already addressing the crowd. "It is with great regret that we inform you our hero cannot be present due to health complications," the mayor was saying into the microphone, his voice amplified across the square, exactly as Thomas pushed Frank's wheelchair into the light of the stage. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as Frank appeared in the wheelchair at the edge of the stage. The mayor froze mid-sentence, his practiced smile faltering as camera flashes erupted like artillery fire across the plaza. For a moment, the only sound was the feedback whine from the microphone and the rustle of hundreds of people shifting to get a better view. Thomas pushed his father's wheelchair forward with deliberate slowness, the rubber wheels creating a soft, rhythmic sound against the wooden stage. Frank sat upright despite the pain radiating across his back, his weathered face set in an expression of quiet determination. The maintenance uniform hung loosely on his frame, an incongruous sight against the formal attire of the dignitaries on stage. The mayor recovered quickly, political instincts kicking in. He stepped away from the podium, arms outstretched in a welcoming gesture that the cameras would capture for the evening news. "Mr. Miller, this is an unexpected honor. We were just informed that your doctors had prohibited you from attending." The microphone picked up his stage whisper. "Should you be here in your condition?" Frank ignored the mayor's question as Thomas positioned the wheelchair beside the podium. The crowd had fallen completely silent now, sensing that something unscripted was unfolding. In the front row, Frank spotted the Rodriguez family, their expressions a mixture of concern and encouragement. A stagehand rushed to adjust the microphone downward for Frank's seated position. The mayor hovered nearby, clearly uncertain whether to retake control or allow the moment to play out. "Thank you all for coming," Frank began, his voice raspy but carrying clearly through the speakers. The simple greeting triggered another round of applause, which Frank waited out patiently. He could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool spring air. The fever was worsening. "I'm not here to be celebrated as a hero," he continued, once the applause subsided. "I'm here to correct a mistake." The crowd murmured, and Frank saw confusion ripple across the faces of the politicians seated in a row of chairs behind him. The fire that endangered the Rodriguez family. Frank paused, drawing a labored breath that triggered a brief coughing fit. Thomas moved to his side, offering water, but Frank waved him away. "That fire was caused by faulty electrical work that I installed months earlier." The murmurs intensified. Camera operators repositioned, zeroing in on Frank's face. The mayor took a half step toward the podium before thinking better of it. "The Rodriguez family needed special electrical outlets for their daughter's medical equipment. They couldn't afford an electrician, so I offered to help." Frank gestured toward the family in the front row. "I thought I remembered enough from my Army days to do it safely. I was wrong." A ripple of reaction moved through the crowd. Some faces showed confusion, others dawning comprehension. The politicians on stage exchanged glances, clearly trying to calculate the shifting public relations implications. Now, their insurance company is denying their claim because of my unauthorized modifications. They've lost everything: their home, their belongings, the medical equipment that Emily needs daily. Frank's voice strengthened as he continued, fueled by conviction rather than physical stamina. "And instead of helping them, we're having a ceremony to celebrate me." From the corner of his eye, Frank saw veterans moving closer to the stage. Mike Donnelly and others from yesterday's demonstration, some in wheelchairs, others standing tall despite age and infirmity. They formed a loose semicircle, a silent presence, impossible to ignore. The Rodriguez family is currently living in a shelter, Frank continued. They've been threatened with investigation into their immigration status if they pursue their insurance claim. They were planning to flee to Cincinnati tomorrow, rather than continue fighting. The mayor stepped forward then, placing a hand on Frank's shoulder in what appeared to be a supportive gesture, but felt like an attempt to reclaim control. Mr. Miller, these are serious allegations that should perhaps be discussed in a more appropriate forum. This is the appropriate forum, Frank interrupted, shrugging off the mayor's hand. You wanted to use my story. Well, this is my story. The real one, not the sanitized version that makes everyone feel good. The mayor retreated, recognizing the dangerous territory. Frank turned slightly to face the Rodriguez family directly. Mr. Rodriguez works 60 hours a week, keeping other people's gardens beautiful. Mrs. Rodriguez volunteers at Emily's school, despite working night shifts cleaning offices. Emily wants to be a doctor someday. Frank's voice softened. They deserve better than political speeches and empty gestures. From the front row, Mr. Rodriguez nodded almost imperceptibly, a silent acknowledgement passing between the two men. Mrs. Rodriguez wiped tears from her eyes, while Emily watched with solemn attention beyond her years. Frank turned back to address the wider audience, which now included news cameras from multiple stations. I'm not asking for recognition for myself. I'm asking for justice for this family, for real help, not just words. As if on cue, the veterans who had positioned themselves at the front began a slow, deliberate applause. The sound built gradually as others joined in, spreading through the crowd in waves. Frank waited for it to subside before continuing. Any acknowledgement or monetary award intended for me should go directly to the Rodriguez family, he said firmly. And the insurance company that's denying their claim needs to be held accountable. The veterans' applause grew louder, more insistent. Frank saw James in the press section, filming everything, a satisfied smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The mayor approached the microphone again, his political survival instincts clearly calculating the shifting winds. The city, of course, shares Mr. Miller's concern for the Rodriguez family, he began, voice smooth with practiced sincerity. And while we cannot intervene directly in insurance matters, I can announce that we will be exploring options for temporary housing assistance for families displaced by similar emergencies. It was politician speak for damage control, but it was a start. Frank noticed reporters scribbling notes or recording the mayor's words, no doubt already formulating questions about specifics and timelines. A congressman seated behind Frank leaned forward to whisper something to an aide, who quickly left the stage. The public narrative was being recalibrated in real time. The mayor makes an excellent point about housing assistance, Frank acknowledged, seizing the momentum. But Emily also needs specialized medical equipment that was lost in the fire, equipment that insurance should cover. As he spoke, Frank felt a disturbing heaviness settling in his chest, each breath becoming more labored than the last. The fever burned hotter, and dark spots began to dance at the edges of his vision. He gripped the sides of the podium to steady himself. Thomas noticed his father's deteriorating condition and moved closer, concern evident on his face. Frank gave him a small shake of the head. Not yet. He wasn't finished. I've spent decades believing that what we did in Vietnam meant nothing, Frank continued, his voice growing hoarser. That our sacrifices were forgotten, or worse, despised. I shut myself away because it was easier than facing a world that didn't seem to care. The veterans in the crowd stood straighter, many nodding in silent understanding. But now I realize something important. Frank paused, gathering his remaining strength. It doesn't matter if the world recognizes what we did. What matters is that we did what was right, even when it was hard, even when it hurt, even when no one was watching. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant sound of traffic and the rustling of spring leaves in the plaza trees. The Rodriguez family needs our help now, not our applause, Frank concluded. And I'm asking everyone here, the city officials, the media, my fellow veterans, all of you, to make sure they get it. As the final words left his lips, Frank felt the last of his strength ebbing away. The pneumonia that Dr. Kapoor had warned about was tightening its grip on his lungs. The dark spots in his vision expanded, merging into a gathering darkness. Thomas must have noticed the change immediately. He stepped forward, one hand on his father's shoulder, the other reaching for the microphone to move it away. "I think that's all for now," Thomas began, but Frank wasn't finished. With a final surge of will, Frank leaned forward to speak once more into the microphone. "The Rodriguez family will be accepting donations at an account set up by the veterans of foreign wars. No donation is too small. And the insurance company," he paused, looking directly at the news cameras, "might want to reconsider their position before this becomes a national story about how they treat families in crisis." The crowd erupted in applause and cheers, veterans in the front rows standing at attention in a spontaneous show of respect. The mayor, recognizing the shift in public sentiment, stepped forward to shake Frank's hand for the cameras, leaning in to whisper something that was lost in the noise. Frank nodded vaguely in response, no longer fully processing what was happening around him. The fever had taken firm hold now, his body trembling visibly despite his efforts to appear strong. Each breath felt like inhaling fire, the pneumonia closing his lungs like a vice. Thomas bent down, his face close to his father's ear. "We need to get you back to the hospital. Now." Frank tried to respond but could only manage a weak nod. As Thomas began to wheel him toward the edge of the stage, Frank caught a final glimpse of the Rodriguez family. They were surrounded by people offering handshakes and words of support, reporters extending microphones, veterans forming a protective semicircle around them. A burst of applause followed Frank as Thomas guided the wheelchair off the stage. Mike waited nearby with the car, engine running. The last thing Frank registered was being lifted from the wheelchair into the back seat, Thomas's worried face hovering above him, and the distant wail of sirens approaching the plaza. As Thomas moved to help Frank leave the stage, he collapsed in the wheelchair with a severe respiratory crisis, cameras capturing the dramatic moment, leaving the audience in shock and paramedics rushing to the stage. The ambulance siren wailed through the city streets, its urgent cry parting traffic like Moses at the Red Sea. Inside, Frank drifted in and out of consciousness, oxygen mask fogging with each labored breath. Paramedics moved with practiced efficiency around him, calling out vital signs and administering medications. Thomas sat in the corner, gripping the handrail so tightly his knuckles turned white, watching his father's ashen face with undisguised fear. "BP dropping to 90-60, a paramedic announced. "Oxygen saturation 82%. Thomas leaned forward. "Is he going to—" "We're doing everything we can, sir," the paramedic interrupted, her tone professional but kind. "We'll be at the hospital in 3 minutes. The ambulance lurched around a corner and Thomas caught a glimpse of the City Hall Plaza, receding in the distance. The ceremony continuing without them, the ripples of Frank's unexpected appearance still spreading outward like shockwaves. At the hospital, Dr. Kapoor was waiting at the emergency entrance, arms crossed, expression oscillating between professional concern and personal disappointment. "I warned him," she said as the gurney rushed past, Frank's still form disappearing through the double doors. "I explicitly told him this could happen." "I know," Thomas replied, hurrying to keep pace. "But he had to do it." Dr. Kapoor gave him a measured look. "The most stubborn patients often make the most compelling cases for their own recklessness." She pushed through the doors after Frank. "Wait here. I'll update you when I can." In the sterile hallway, Thomas paced, checking his phone every few minutes as messages flooded in. The local VA office director offering resources, James sending video clips of the ceremony's aftermath, Mike reporting that veterans were organizing an impromptu fundraiser on the plaza. And most surprisingly, a message from the insurance commissioner's office requesting details about the Rodriguez family's case. Thomas paused his pacing to watch the news feed on his phone. The media had jumped on the story with predictable fervor, but the focus had shifted. Instead of celebrating Frank's heroism, reporters were now questioning the insurance company's practices, interviewing shelter residents about their experiences, and highlighting the plight of families like the Rodriguezes. "Mr. Miller?" Thomas looked up to see the mayor's aide, approaching, still wearing his ceremony attire, looking distinctly uncomfortable in the hospital setting. "How is your father?" the aide asked, not quite meeting Thomas's eyes. "Fighting," Thomas answered simply. "What do you want?" The aide shifted his weight. "The mayor would like to visit to show support. Perhaps a photo opportunity when your father is feeling better." "Get out." Thomas's voice was quiet but carried an unmistakable edge. "My father isn't a prop for your political theater." The aide retreated without another word, passing a group of veterans who had gathered near the hospital entrance. Thomas recognized Mike among them, their silent vigil a stark contrast to the pomp of the official ceremony. Hours passed in the familiar purgatory of hospital waiting rooms. Susan arrived after her shift, bringing coffee and updates from the medical staff. Frank had been moved to the ICU, placed on stronger antibiotics, his pneumonia progressing to a dangerous degree. "They're monitoring him closely," Susan explained. "His age and the smoke damage to his lungs are complicating factors, but Dr. Kapoor is consulting with specialists." Thomas nodded mechanically, processing. "Can I see him?" "Soon. They're still getting him settled." Susan hesitated. "Your father is a fighter, Thomas. I've seen patients recover from worse." The waiting room television played continuous coverage of the ceremony's dramatic conclusion. Thomas watched with detached interest as reporters speculated about Frank's health and the implications of his speech. The insurance company had issued a terse statement about reviewing all cases thoroughly and fairly, corporate doublespeak that avoided addressing the Rodriguez situation directly. "He did it," Thomas murmured, half to himself. "They can't ignore this now." When Dr. Kapoor finally emerged, her face revealed little. "He's stabilized for now. The next 24 hours will be critical. The infection is severe, and his body has been through significant trauma." "But he'll recover?" Thomas pressed. Dr. Kapoor's expression softened slightly. "Your father has a remarkable will to live, Mr. Miller. That counts for a lot." She paused. "He's asking for you." In the ICU, Frank looked smaller somehow, diminished against the white hospital sheets, tubes, and wires, connecting him to various machines. His eyes were closed when Thomas entered, but they fluttered open at the sound of footsteps. "Did it work?" Frank's voice was barely audible beneath the oxygen mask. Thomas moved closer to the bed. "It's working. The insurance commissioner is involved now. The veterans have started a fundraiser. The Rodriguez family is getting attention. The right kind." A ghost of a smile crossed Frank's pale face. "Good." He closed his eyes briefly, gathering strength. "Need you to get something from my apartment." "Dad, don't worry about—" "A journal," Frank interrupted. "In the bottom drawer of my dresser under the old photos." Each word seemed to cost him considerable effort. "Need you to read it." Thomas frowned. "Why now?" "Because I should have shown you years ago." Frank's eyes drifted closed again. "Go." Outside the ICU, Thomas found Mr. Rodriguez waiting anxiously, still wearing the same clothes from the ceremony. "How is he?" Rodriguez asked. "Stable for now," Thomas replied. "What are you doing here? I thought you'd be with your family." Rodriguez gestured vaguely. "Many people at the plaza offering help. Emily is with her mother." He paused. "The mayor's office, they called me. They are offering temporary housing in a city-owned building. and the insurance company called too. Thomas raised an eyebrow. And? They say they are reconsidering our case in light of new information. Rodriguez made air quotes with his bandaged hands. Your father, he did this, he changed everything. Thomas nodded, throat suddenly tight. That's who he is, who he's always been underneath it all. Later that evening, Thomas let himself into Frank's apartment with the spare key, feeling like an intruder despite his father's instructions. The place was just as they'd left it days ago, sparse, utilitarian, with few personal touches beyond the bookshelves filled with military history. Thomas had always found it depressing, this monk-like existence his father had carved out for himself after his mother died. He located the dresser drawer easily enough, pulling it open to reveal neatly folded clothes with a stack of old photographs beneath. Below these was a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth with handling. Thomas hesitated, feeling the weight of intrusion, then remembered his father's insistence. Back at the hospital, Thomas settled into the ICU waiting room, opening the journal carefully. The first pages were dated 1969, the handwriting sharper and more defined than his father's current scrawl. For the next hour, Thomas read silently, occasionally stopping to process what he was learning. The journal chronicled Frank's tour in Vietnam, with unflinching honesty. The fear, the confusion, the moments of unexpected connection with both fellow soldiers and Vietnamese civilians. Names that Thomas had never heard his father mention appeared repeatedly. Martinez, Wilkins, Cho, Jackson. Men who had lived and died alongside Frank in that distant jungle. One entry from March 1969 was longer than the others, the ink pressed harder into the page as if written with great emotional force. Today, we were ordered to evacuate a village before an artillery strike. Not enough choppers, not enough time. I made trips back and forth, carrying children to the landing zone, while mortar rounds landed closer with each pass. The last family was trapped in a collapsing hut. Mother, father, 2 small children. I could see their hands reaching out through the flames. Just couldn't reach them in time. Cho pulled me back as the structure gave way. Said I would have died too. Maybe I should have. How do you live with the ones you couldn't save? Thomas paused, a chill running through him as he recognized the date. March 12th, 1969. Exactly 50 years to the day before the fire in the Rodriguez's apartment. Susan found him still reading when she returned for her night shift. She sat beside him quietly for a moment before speaking. My brother told me more about that day, she said. The day your father saved him. James said that Frank had already evacuated a dozen civilians under fire when he spotted a wounded photographer pinned down in a rice paddy. Everyone else had pulled back to the extraction point, but Frank went back for him. Thomas looked up from the journal. He never told me any of this. Susan nodded sadly. Many of them didn't, couldn't. When they came home to protests and hostility, they learned to bury those experiences. My brother tried to publish a series on individual acts of heroism in Vietnam, but his editors said the public wasn't interested. They wanted atrocity stories, not complexity. The revelation struck Thomas with unexpected force, that his father's silence hadn't been stubbornness or emotional distance, but a learned response to a country that hadn't wanted to hear his truth. He's been carrying this alone for 50 years, Thomas said quietly. Not anymore, Susan replied. Over the next several days, Frank's condition improved incrementally. The antibiotics began to control the pneumonia, and his oxygen levels stabilized. Thomas spent his days alternating between the hospital and coordinating the rapidly expanding support network for the Rodriguez family. The veterans who had stood vigil outside the hospital organized a rotation, ensuring that someone was always present. They shared stories about Frank that Thomas had never heard, filling in the outlines of the man his father had been before Vietnam, during the war, and in those difficult years after returning home. Local news outlets continued to follow the story, focusing increasingly on the broader issues it represented: treatment of veterans, predatory insurance practices, the challenges faced by families like the Rodriguezes. The insurance company, overwhelmed by negative publicity, issued a new statement announcing a review of policy language regarding electrical modifications and promising a quick resolution to the Rodriguez case. One morning, Thomas arrived at the hospital to find the waiting area filled with unfamiliar faces, younger veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan who had heard about Frank and come to pay their respects. "We read about what he did," explained a woman in her 30s with a prosthetic leg, "both in Vietnam and with the fire. Some of us are dealing with similar stuff, feeling forgotten, fighting bureaucracy. We wanted to meet him, maybe learn from his experience." Thomas was arranging for them to visit in small groups when his phone rang, the shelter coordinator informing him that a package had arrived for Frank. Inside was a VHS tape dated 1970 and a note explaining that this was footage shot by James, Susan's brother, testifying about young soldiers like Frank who had saved civilians during the war. The footage had never aired due to the political climate of the time. That evening, as Thomas sat beside his father's hospital bed, watching him breathe more easily for the first time in days, he pulled out the journal and began to read aloud from entries he had selected. Moments of courage, of connection, of humanity amid the chaos of war. Frank listened with closed eyes, occasionally nodding or squeezing his son's hand. "Why didn't you ever tell me these stories?" Thomas asked finally. Frank opened his eyes, clear now without the fever's haze. "Because for a long time I couldn't bear to remember. And then, when I could, I thought it was too late." Thomas shook his head, placing the journal on the bedside table. "It's never too late, Dad." As Thomas folded the journal to put it away, a faded photograph slipped from between its pages, a Vietnamese family standing before a simple hut, smiling cautiously at the camera. On the back, written in his father's hand, "The day I failed, March 12th, 1969. Exactly 50 years before the fire in the Rodriguez's apartment." Thomas sat beside his father's hospital bed, the faded photograph resting between them like a fragile bridge connecting past and present. He studied the image, a Vietnamese family standing before a simple thatch-roofed hut, their faces revealing cautious smiles for the American camera. The date on the back haunted him. March 12, 1969, exactly 50 years before the apartment fire. "Can you tell me about them?" Thomas asked gently, turning the photograph toward his father. Frank's eyes, clearer now as the antibiotics slowly conquered the pneumonia, fixed on the image. His weathered hand reached out, fingertips brushing the faces captured half a century ago. "Their name was Nguyen," Frank began, his voice raspy but steadier than it had been in days. "The father was a schoolteacher before the war. The mother made the best spring rolls I've ever tasted." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "She insisted on feeding our patrol whenever we passed through, even when they barely had enough for themselves." Thomas leaned forward, watching his father's expression shift as memories surfaced. Not the haunted look he'd glimpsed over the years when Vietnam was accidentally mentioned, but something more nuanced, more human. "Our unit was assigned to evacuate their village before an artillery strike," Frank continued. "Not enough helicopters, not enough time. We were making trips back and forth to the landing zone, carrying children, helping the elderly." His breathing quickened slightly. "The shelling started early. The North Vietnamese must have gotten intelligence about the evacuation." Frank paused, closing his eyes briefly. Thomas waited, not pushing. "I'd already made 3 trips to the choppers. My lieutenant wanted me to board the last one out, said I'd done enough. But I saw the Nguyens still in their hut, gathering what little they could carry." Frank's voice grew distant. "I ran back for them. The mortars were landing closer. Their hut took a direct hit just as I reached it." Thomas could see his father was no longer in the hospital room, but back in that village, smoke and chaos surrounding him. The structure collapsed. I could see their hands through the flames reaching out, hear the children screaming. I tried to get to them, but Frank's voice broke. Martinez, our radio man, had to drag me away. The whole place was coming down. He saved my life, but I couldn't save them. Not a single one. Thomas placed his hand over his father's. That wasn't your failure, Dad. That was war. Frank shook his head slightly. I've carried them with me every day since, their faces in my dreams. When I saw Emily Rodriguez trapped in that fire, his eyes met Thomas's. It was like the universe giving me a second chance. The weight of this revelation settled between them, the symmetry of tragedy and redemption, separated by exactly 50 years. Thomas understood now why his father had risked everything to save the Rodriguez family, why he'd fought so hard for them afterward. It wasn't just about present circumstances. It was about finally laying old ghosts to rest. The door opened softly and Susan entered, her shift finished, but her presence now a constant as both nurse and friend. I brought something, she said, holding a thick manila envelope. James compiled this. Testimonies from people whose lives Frank touched during the war. Civilians, fellow soldiers, journalists. Stories that never made it into the official record. She handed the envelope to Thomas, who opened it carefully. Inside were dozens of pages. Letters, transcribed interviews, photocopied journal entries, all speaking to Frank Miller's character and actions during the war. Some were from Vietnamese civilians who remembered the kind American soldier who shared his rations with children. Others from fellow veterans recalling specific instances when Frank had risked his life for others. James collected these for years, Susan explained. He always hoped to publish them someday, to counter the public narrative about soldiers in Vietnam. But the timing was never right. Frank stared at the documents with visible emotion. I didn't know. I thought no one remembered. Many people remembered Mr. Miller, Susan said gently. They just didn't have a platform to tell their stories, any more than you did. Thomas began organizing the materials chronologically, creating a visual timeline of his father's war experience. As he worked, Dr. Kapoor entered for her evening rounds, reviewing Frank's charts with newfound optimism. Your lungs are showing improvement, she announced. The fever's gone, and your oxygen levels are stabilizing. I'm cautiously optimistic about your recovery. Frank nodded, his attention still on the photographs and documents spread across his bed. Dr. Kapoor noticed his distraction and moved closer, her clinical detachment softening as she glimpsed the Vietnam images. My father served in the Indian Army, she said unexpectedly. Different conflict, similar aftermath. The silence, the nightmares. We never understood why he wouldn't talk about it. She adjusted Frank's IV with practiced efficiency. Perhaps we never asked the right questions. After she left, Thomas continued arranging the timeline while Frank identified faces and places in the photographs. It became a collaborative effort, Frank's memories flowing more freely than Thomas had ever witnessed, filling in the human details behind the clinical military records. As evening deepened into night, Frank grew tired, but seemed reluctant to stop. There was an urgency to his storytelling now, as if a dam had broken after decades of carefully maintained silence. You should rest, Dad, Thomas finally suggested, gathering the materials. We can continue tomorrow. Frank caught his wrist. I wasted so many years not talking about this, not even with your mother, who deserved to understand why I was the way I was. His grip tightened slightly. I don't want to waste any more time. Thomas settled back into his chair. Then I'm listening. Over the next several days, Frank's physical recovery progressed alongside a different kind of healing. The timeline expanded, including not just Vietnam, but the difficult years after, the jobs lost when employers discovered his military background, the nightmares that drove a wedge between him and his young family, the gradual withdrawal from social connections that felt too dangerous to maintain. Thomas brought in a journal of his own, making notes and occasionally sharing memories from his childhood, moments when his father's trauma had manifested in ways he hadn't understood at the time. These exchanges were sometimes painful but necessary, building a new understanding between them. On the fourth day, Mr. Rodriguez arrived with unexpected news, Emily trailing behind him with a new drawing clutched in her small hands. "The insurance company has reversed their decision," Rodriguez announced, his face brightening with cautious optimism. "They will cover everything: the apartment damage, our belongings, Emily's medical equipment. They say it is because of extenuating circumstances." "Public pressure works wonders on corporate conscience," Thomas observed dryly. Emily approached Frank's bed, holding up her drawing, a colorful depiction of two men building a house together. One was clearly her father. The other, with a cane and silver hair, was unmistakably Frank. "Is this for me?" Frank asked, his voice softer than Thomas had heard in years. Emily nodded solemnly. "Daddy says we're getting a new home. Will you help us build it?" Frank smiled, taking the drawing with careful hands. "I might not be much help with the building part anymore, but I'll be there." Rodriguez stepped forward. "There is more news. The mayor's office called yesterday. They are offering us temporary housing in a city-owned apartment while our insurance claim is processed. It is in a good location, close to Emily's doctors." "That's excellent," Thomas said. "When do you move in?" "Tomorrow," Rodriguez replied. "The veterans from the ceremony, they have arranged trucks to move what little we have, and many have offered furniture, household items." He shook his head in wonderment. "A week ago, I thought we would be leaving everything behind, starting over with nothing in Cincinnati." As Rodriguez shared more details about their new arrangements, Thomas watched his father's face. There was a peace there he couldn't recall seeing before, not the resignation that had masqueraded as contentment for so many years, but genuine tranquility. Dr. Kapoor arrived later that afternoon with members of the pulmonology team. After a thorough examination, she delivered news that surprised even her. "Your recovery is exceeding expectations," she told Frank. "The antibiotics have controlled the infection, and your lungs are showing remarkable improvement. If this continues, we might consider releasing you within a week." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "That soon? What about his burns?" "They're healing well," Dr. Kapoor replied. "He would need home care visits, of course, and regular follow-ups." She looked directly at Frank. "The question is where you would recuperate. Your apartment building still has smoke damage in the common areas." Before Frank could respond, Thomas spoke up. "He'll stay with me and Laura. We have a ground-floor guest room that would work perfectly." Frank opened his mouth, likely to protest, then closed it again. After a moment, he simply nodded. That might be a good arrangement, for a while. Thomas blinked in surprise, having prepared counter-arguments for his father's expected resistance. This easy acceptance represented yet another shift in their evolving relationship. Later, as dusk painted the hospital windows in amber light, Thomas worked on his laptop while Frank dozed. A news alert prompted him to turn on the television, where coverage of the Rodriguez family's situation was unfolding. The mayor stood before cameras, announcing a new city program for emergency housing assistance and expedited insurance claim review in cases of residential fires. Inspired by recent events, the mayor declared smoothly, as if the program had been his idea all along, "We're establishing a task force to address gaps in our emergency response system for displaced families." Frank stirred awake, catching the end of the announcement. "Politicians," he muttered, "always ready to jump on a moving train and pretend they built the tracks." Thomas chuckled. "Still, it might help other families in the future." "True enough," Frank conceded. "Strange how things work out sometimes." As the news continued, Thomas noticed his father studying him with an uncharacteristic openness. "What?" Thomas asked. "Just thinking," Frank replied. "About time, about second chances." He gestured toward the timeline of photographs and documents they'd created together. "I spent decades believing I'd failed those people in Vietnam, that nothing I did there mattered." "But it did matter," Thomas said. "To them, to the ones you saved." Frank nodded slowly. "And now I'm wondering what else I missed by looking backward for so long. What I might have missed with you, with your family." Thomas felt a tightness in his throat. "We're still here, Dad. Still time." Frank reached for the envelope on his bedside table, extracting an official-looking invitation that had arrived that morning. "Small ceremony. Just veterans and community members. No politicians or cameras," he read aloud. "To honor not what you did, but who you are." The morning sun painted golden rectangles across the hospital floor as Dr. Kapoor signed the discharge papers with a flourish. For the first time in nearly 3 weeks, Frank Miller was going home, or at least leaving the sterile confines that had become his temporary residence. "I want to see you back here in 1 week," Dr. Kapoor said, her stern tone undermined by the faint smile playing at her lips. "And follow the home care instructions precisely. Those burns need proper attention, and your lungs are still healing." Frank nodded, already dressed in clothes Thomas had brought, comfortable slacks and a button-up shirt that hung looser than before on his diminished frame. The wheelchair required by hospital policy waited by the door, a final indignity he'd grudgingly accepted. "Ready to break out of this joint?" Thomas asked, entering with a duffel bag containing Frank's few personal items. "More than ready," Frank replied, carefully pushing himself to his feet. The journey through the hospital corridors felt strangely ceremonial. Nurses and orderlies who had cared for him stopped to wish him well. Susan, off-duty but present for the occasion, walked alongside offering last-minute advice about medications and warning signs to watch for. At the main entrance, Frank insisted on standing from the wheelchair for the final steps to Thomas's waiting car. The effort sent pain lancing across his healing burns, but the satisfaction of walking out under his own power was worth it. He leaned heavily on his cane, a new one Thomas had bought to replace the one lost in the fire, and took measured steps into the April sunshine. "Take it slow," Thomas cautioned, hovering nearby. Frank paused at the top of the ramp, unexpectedly overwhelmed by the open sky above, the unfiltered sounds of the city, the scent of newly bloomed dogwoods from the hospital landscaping. Freedom, even constrained by physical limitations, tasted sweeter than he'd remembered. The drive to his apartment building was quiet, Frank watching the familiar streets with new eyes. When they arrived, his gaze lifted to the blackened section of the facade where the Rodriguez apartment had been. "Construction crews are starting next week," Thomas explained, following his father's line of sight. "The insurance settlement came through faster than anyone expected. Amazing what public pressure can accomplish." Inside the building, neighbors emerged from their apartments as if summoned by silent alarm. Mrs. Patel rushed forward with home-cooked food in covered containers. Mr. Guzman from 2C offered a firm handshake and thanks for saving their building from worse damage. Even the typically antisocial college student from across the hall appeared, awkwardly presenting a card signed by multiple residents. This impromptu reception continued as they made their way to Frank's door. He accepted the attention with a gracious discomfort. Uneasy with gratitude, he still didn't feel he'd earned. Thomas unlocked the apartment, and Frank stepped inside, expecting the familiar Spartan surroundings. Instead, he found his living room transformed, filled with drawings from Emily tacked carefully to the walls, a new reading lamp beside his armchair, fresh curtains on the windows, and a small bookshelf stocked with titles he didn't recognize. "Your old place needed some updating," Thomas explained. misinterpreting Frank's stunned silence. Laura helped pick things out. We tried not to change too much, just make it more livable, Frank finished, moving slowly through the space, touching surfaces as if to confirm their reality. It's good, thank you. He paused at the new bookshelf, scanning titles, modern fiction, military memoirs from recent conflicts, a few photography books focused on Vietnam's landscapes today. Books selected with evident thought about who he was, who he might become. A knock at the open door interrupted his exploration. Mr. Rodriguez stood in the hallway, a toolbox in his bandaged hand. "Welcome home, Mr. Miller," he said. "I came to see if you need help settling in." Frank gestured him inside, noting the irony. The man whose home he'd helped destroy here to help restore his. "I think Thomas has handled most of it, but come in, please." Rodriguez entered, setting down his toolbox. "We have moved in too," he said. "Apartment 2B. The mayor's office arranged it. Temporary, they say, but good for 6 months at least." "You're staying in this building?" Frank asked, surprised. Rodriguez nodded. "It was Emily's request. She wants to be near her hero." Frank's face warmed with embarrassment. "I'm no hero." "To an 8-year-old girl who would not be alive without you?" Rodriguez shrugged expressively. "You cannot change this, my friend." The afternoon passed with visitors coming and going, Susan bringing medications from the hospital pharmacy, Mike Donnelly and other veterans dropping by with news of their fundraising efforts, even James appearing briefly with his camera to document Frank's homecoming for a feature he was developing. By evening, Frank was exhausted but filled with a curious contentment. Thomas had stayed, ordering delivery from Frank's favorite Vietnamese restaurant, a choice that would have seemed insensitive weeks ago but now felt like an appropriate acknowledgement of bridges being built between past and present. "You should stay at our place tonight," Thomas suggested as they finished eating. "First night home can be rough. We've got the guest room ready." Frank shook his head. "I need to be in my own space. Get reacquainted with normal life." He paused, seeing his son's concern. "But maybe tomorrow night, for dinner with the family." This compromise satisfied Thomas, who left reluctantly after making sure Frank had everything needed within easy reach. Medications, water, phone charged, and programmed with emergency contacts. Alone for the first time in weeks, Frank settled into his armchair, the familiar contours supporting his healing body. The apartment felt different now, not just the new additions, but something less tangible. The space seemed more connected to the outside world, less a fortress against memory. Frank dozed, waking to the sound of childish laughter in the hallway. For a moment, he was disoriented, the boundary between dream and reality unclear. Then came a soft knock at his door. He rose stiffly, using his cane for support, and opened the door to find Emily Rodriguez bouncing excitedly beside her mother, who held a covered dish. "We brought dinner for tomorrow," Emily announced. "Mama made special rice pudding because Daddy says you need to gain weight." Mrs. Rodriguez offered an apologetic smile. "We should have called first. Emily was insistent on visiting before bedtime." "It's fine," Frank assured her, stepping back to allow them inside. "I was just sitting with my thoughts. Company's better." Emily moved immediately to the bookshelves, examining the new additions with childish curiosity while her mother placed the dish in Frank's refrigerator. "The apartment they have given us is very nice," Mrs. Rodriguez said quietly. "Clean, with new appliances. Emily's medical equipment has all been replaced, better ones than we had before. Your son's law firm has been very helpful with the paperwork." Frank nodded, watching Emily, who had discovered a chess set Thomas must have unpacked from storage. "I'm glad things are working out. You deserve that much, at least." "What we deserve and what we receive are rarely the same thing in this life," Mrs. Rodriguez replied, with the wisdom of someone intimate with hardship. "But sometimes, Unexpected blessings arrived through difficult circumstances. After they left, Frank found himself too restless for sleep, despite his fatigue. He moved carefully around his apartment, reacquainting himself with possessions that now seemed simultaneously familiar and strange. Books he'd read countless times, photographs he'd hidden away for decades, spaces defined by absence as much as presence. The following weeks established new rhythms. Thomas and his family visited regularly, bringing grandchildren who regarded Frank with a mixture of fascination and uncertainty. The Rodriguez family became fixtures in his daily life, Emily stopping by after school to share drawings or practice the chess moves Frank was teaching her, Mr. Rodriguez helping with small repairs around the apartment, Mrs. Rodriguez occasionally leaving homemade meals that were gently forcing weight back onto Frank's frame. Veterans from the ceremony, initially strangers despite their shared experiences, began gathering in Frank's apartment on Thursday evenings. What started as casual conversations evolved into something more structured. Younger veterans from recent conflicts seeking guidance about navigating the system. Older Vietnam vets finally discussing experiences long buried. Frank found himself emerged from isolation, participating in a community he hadn't realized he'd been missing. The nightmares still came occasionally, but they no longer dominated his dreamscape. More frequently now, he dreamed of building things, of hands reaching out not in desperation, but in greeting. 1 month after his discharge from the hospital, Frank stood in the community room of the VFW hall, surrounded by fellow veterans and neighbors. The promised small ceremony, organized without politicians or cameras, had drawn a surprisingly large crowd of people whose lives had intersected with Frank's in ways large and small. There were no podiums, no formal speeches. Instead, people gathered in a circle, sharing stories that connected individual experiences to a larger narrative about service, sacrifice, and the complicated journey home. When it came time for Frank to speak, he rose slowly, leaning less heavily on his cane than he had weeks before. He looked around the circle, at Thomas and his family, at the Rodriguez family, at Susan and James, at fellow veterans whose faces had become familiar once again after decades of self-imposed isolation. "I spent most of my life trying to forget," Frank began. "Trying to bury the things I'd seen, the people I couldn't save. I built walls to keep the memories out, but all I really did was trap myself inside with them." He paused, gathering thoughts that now came more easily than they had in years. "The fire that brought us all together was a terrible thing. I'll always regret my part in causing it. But through that destruction came a kind of rebuilding I never expected, not just of apartments and possessions, but of connections I thought were lost forever." The room remained silent, respectful of each word that clearly cost emotional effort to share. "Someone wise recently told me that what we deserve and what we receive in life are rarely the same thing," Frank continued, nodding toward Mrs. Rodriguez. "I'm learning that sometimes what we receive is better than what we think we deserve. Second chances, new beginnings, the opportunity to carry someone else to safety, even when your knees complain the whole way." Emily giggled at this last part, breaking the solemn mood. Her laughter, bright and uncomplicated, sparked smiles throughout the room. Afterward, as people mingled and shared refreshments, Frank found himself beside Thomas, watching the diverse gathering with quiet satisfaction. "You know," Thomas said, "I've been thinking about that assisted living place that's been after you to move in." Frank tensed slightly. "I thought we'd moved past that discussion." "We have," Thomas assured him. "I was going to say I don't think you need it anymore, but maybe we could look for a place closer to us. A small house, perhaps. Close enough for regular dinners, far enough for independence." Frank considered this, watching Emily playing checkers with his granddaughter across the room, 2 generations connecting without the barriers he'd maintained for so long. "I'd like that," he said finally. "Might be good to be closer for all of us." Thomas nodded, clearly pleased but trying not to show it too obviously. I'll start looking into options." As the gathering began to disperse, Emily approached with a question that had clearly been weighing on her young mind. "Mr. Frank," she asked seriously, "were you a superhero before you got old?" Frank laughed, surprising himself with the genuine sound. "No, sweetheart. I only became one after I got old and realized it's never too late to carry someone to safety, even when your knee complains the whole way.